The Complete Philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, a documentary script. The year is 1860. In a modest apartment in Frankfurt, Germany, a 72-year-old man sits alone with his poodle, Atma. Arthur Schopenhauer, once dismissed and ridiculed by academia, has finally gained the recognition he always knew he deserved. But recognition came too late to change the essential solitude that defined his existence. For decades, he dined alone at the same restaurant, walked alone through the same streets, and developed in isolation what would become one of the most influential philosophical systems in Western thought. From his youth, his mind had been inclined toward the deepest questions of existence. What is the nature of reality? Why is there so much suffering? How should one live in a world filled with pain? Unlike other philosophers who built elaborate systems to justify optimism, Schopenhauer had the courage to look directly at life's darkness and describe what he actually saw. His honesty and his influence would extend far beyond philosophy into psychology, literature, music, and the modern understanding of human nature. What Schopenhauer created represents perhaps the most psychologically penetrating philosophical system ever developed by a Western thinker. His masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, revolutionized how we understand consciousness, desire, and suffering. His essays on ethics, aesthetics, and the art of living contain wisdom that cuts straight to the heart of human experience. Together, these works form a comprehensive guide to understanding not just how the world appears, but what it fundamentally is, and how we might find peace within it. But here is what makes Schopenhauer truly extraordinary. He was not a philosopher who developed his ideas in comfortable isolation from life's difficulties. His mother was cold and dismissive, eventually cutting off contact entirely. His father likely died by suicide. He witnessed the Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath. He lost most of his inheritance in bad investments. He was rejected by the academic establishment and spent most of his career in obscurity. Every principle he developed was forged in the crucible of genuine suffering and disappointment. Yet from this darkness emerged something remarkable. A philosophy so honest about suffering that it actually provides relief from suffering. A worldview so pessimistic in its analysis that it becomes liberating in its implications. A system of thought that acknowledges life's pain while pointing toward genuine sources of consolation. What you are about to discover is not just ancient wisdom or academic philosophy. You are about to learn a way of seeing reality that has been tested against the hardest aspects of human experience, refined through decades of solitary contemplation, and proven valuable across generations. Every principle we will explore comes from a man who faced life without illusions and refused to offer false comfort. Whether you're struggling with disappointment, seeking to understand your desires, trying to find meaning in suffering, or simply wanting to see reality more clearly, Schopenhauer's Complete Philosophy provides the map. Not a map to happiness in the conventional sense, but something more valuable. A map to understanding, acceptance, and the peace that comes from seeing things as they truly are. Part 1. The Foundation. The World. As will philosophy begins with wonder, but Schopenhauer's philosophy began with something deeper, a profound sense that something was fundamentally wrong with existence itself. While other philosophers were constructing elaborate systems to demonstrate the rationality and goodness of the world, Schopenhauer looked at the same world and saw something completely different. He saw a reality driven by blind striving, endless craving, and inevitable suffering. Most people accept the world as it appears to them. They see objects in space and time, causes and effects, purposes and meanings. They assume that what they perceive is basically what exists. But Schopenhauer, following Kant, understood that this everyday world is merely appearance, merely representation. The world as we experience it is structured by our own minds. Space, time, and causality are not features of reality itself, but the spectacles through which we must view reality. But if the world we perceive is only appearance, what lies behind the appearance? What is the thing in itself, the ultimate reality that underlies all phenomena? This was the question that previous philosophers had declared unknowable. But Schopenhauer believed he had discovered the answer through an extraordinary insight. We have direct, immediate access to ultimate reality through our own inner experience. When you look at your hand, you see it as an object in space, existing alongside other objects. But you also experience your hand from within. You experience it as will, as the immediate impulse to move, to grasp, to act. This inner experience is not mediated by space, time, or causality. It is direct knowledge of what you fundamentally are. And Schopenhauer's revolutionary claim was that this will that you experience within yourself is the same force that animates all of existence. Think about what this means. The entire universe, from the pull of gravity to the growth of plants, to the behavior of animals, to human desires and ambitions, is the manifestation of a single underlying reality. Blind, purposeless will. Not will in the sense of conscious intention or rational decision-making, but will as pure striving, pure wanting, pure force, without reason or end. The stone falling to earth wills to fall, though it has no consciousness. The plant wills to grow toward light, though it has no awareness. The animal wills to feed and reproduce, driven by instincts it cannot understand. And you will in every desire you experience, every goal you pursue, every action you take. All of these are manifestations of the same fundamental reality expressing itself at different levels of objectification. This insight transforms everything. When you see a tree growing, you are watching the same will that operates in you, expressing itself in a different form. When you see animals competing for resources, you are seeing the same will turning against itself, as it must, since there is nothing else for it to desire or destroy. When you experience your own desires, frustrations, and sufferings, you are experiencing the fundamental nature of reality itself. But here is the crucial and disturbing implication. This will has no ultimate purpose, no final goal, no rational plan. It is not moving toward anything. It simply is, eternally striving, never satisfied, never complete. Every achievement of the will immediately reveals a new lack, a new desire, a new goal. Every satisfaction is temporary, immediately replaced by new wanting. This is not a flaw in the system. This is the system itself. Consider your own experience carefully. You want something intensely. You work toward it, overcome obstacles, finally achieve it. And then what? A brief moment of satisfaction, quickly fading into either boredom or the emergence of a new desire. The achievement of one goal never brings lasting peace, only the setup for the next pursuit. This pattern is not accidental. It is the structure of existence itself. Schopenhauer saw that life is essentially a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. When we lack what we desire, we suffer. When we have achieved our desires and have nothing left to strive for, we experience the emptiness of boredom, which is itself a form of suffering. There is no stable point of lasting satisfaction, because satisfaction itself is only a temporary pause in the endless process of wanting. Now extend this understanding to all of existence. Every plant competing for resources, every animal hunting or fleeing, every person pursuing their goals is the will, striving blindly, achieving temporary victories that solve nothing, experiencing temporary defeats that change nothing fundamental. The whole spectacle of nature, of history, of individual lives is this same pointless struggle playing out in infinite variations. This is not pessimism for its own sake. This is what Schopenhauer believed he had discovered, the actual truth about existence. The world is not a rational plan working towards some good end. The world is not a moral order rewarding virtue and punishing vice. The world is will objectifying itself in endless forms, struggling against itself, suffering through its own nature, finding no rest and no resolution. But Schopenhauer's analysis goes deeper still. He recognized that individuation itself, the apparent separation between different beings, is ultimately illusory. All separate beings are manifestations of the same underlying will. When one animal devours another, it is the will devouring itself. When humans compete and conflict with each other, it is the will fighting against itself. The appearance of separate individuals pursuing separate interests is ultimately deceptive. There is only one will, expressing itself through all these apparently distinct forms. Understanding this has profound implications. It means that the suffering you see around you is not separate from your own suffering. It means that harming another is ultimately harming yourself, since there is no fundamental distinction between you and them. It means that the boundaries we draw between self and other, between one being and another, are artifacts of our perception, not features of ultimate reality. This is the foundation on which everything else in Schopenhauer's philosophy rests. The world is will. The will is blind striving without purpose. All individuals are manifestations of this one will. Suffering is inherent in the nature of will itself, since will is endless, wanting that can never be finally satisfied. This is not just theory or speculation. This is what Schopenhauer claimed is actually true about existence when you look beneath surface appearances. Master this foundation and everything else becomes clear. The nature of suffering, the possibility of relief, the meaning of compassion, the value of art, the path to peace. All of these emerge naturally once you understand what the world fundamentally is. Miss this foundation, and even sophisticated philosophy remains abstract theory disconnected from lived reality. Part 2. The problem. Understanding suffering. If the world is will, and will is endless striving that can never achieve final satisfaction, then suffering is not a problem to be solved, but the basic condition of existence. This is perhaps Schopenhauer's most important and most disturbing insight. Most philosophies and religions treat suffering as something that needs explanation, something abnormal that entered a world that should be good. But Schopenhauer turns this completely around. Suffering is normal. Suffering is what we should expect given the nature of reality. What requires explanation is not why there is suffering, but whether any relief from suffering is possible. Think about the structure of desire itself. Every desire begins with a lack, a dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing. This lack is inherently painful. You want something you do not have, and the not having is a form of suffering. The intensity of the suffering depends on the intensity of the desire, but the basic structure remains the same. Wanting is suffering. Now imagine temporarily satisfying a desire. You get what you wanted. What happens? For a brief moment there is relief, a sense of satisfaction. But this satisfaction is inherently negative. It is merely the temporary removal of the pain of wanting. It is not a positive state of fulfillment, but rather the absence of a negative state. And this negative state immediately begins to return, either as the same desire reasserting itself, or as a new desire emerging to take its place. This means that our moments of satisfaction are nothing but brief pauses between periods of suffering, and these pauses are not even particularly pleasant in themselves. They are simply less painful than active wanting. This is why people who have achieved all their major goals often feel empty and directionless. They expected fulfillment, but discovered that fulfillment is impossible because desire itself is the problem, not the specific objects we happen to desire. Schopenhauer illustrated this with the metaphor of the man pushing a stone uphill, only to have it roll back down again, forcing him to push it up once more in an endless cycle. This is the human condition. We pursue goals, achieve them, and find ourselves immediately facing new goals. The process never ends. There is no summit where we can finally rest, having achieved everything. There is only the endless pushing of stones up endless hills. But it gets worse. Not only is satisfaction temporary and ultimately hollow, but most of our desires will never be satisfied at all. The will wills through every living thing, creating competition for limited resources, conflict of interests, and inevitable frustration. For every desire that is satisfied, countless others must be frustrated because the world cannot possibly accommodate every striving of every being. Consider the suffering inherent in the life of any animal. The constant need to find food while avoiding becoming food. The struggle against the elements, disease, injury, parasites. The inevitable decline into weakness and eventual death. And all of this for what? To survive long enough to reproduce, creating more beings who will experience the same cycle of suffering. Nature is not harmonious beauty. Nature is survival of the fittest, which means endless death, pain, and fear for the less fit. Human life adds layers of psychological suffering that animals are spared. We can anticipate future pain and remember past pain, multiplying our suffering beyond the present moment. We have self-consciousness, which means we can suffer from awareness of our own limitations, failures, and mortality. We have reason, which allows us to imagine alternative possibilities and suffer from the gap between what is and what might have been. We have social existence, which creates endless opportunities for humiliation, rejection, betrayal, and disappointment. Schopenhauer emphasized that the amount of pain in the world vastly outweighs the amount of pleasure. Even in the best human lives, the moments of genuine joy are rare and brief, compared to the constant background of dissatisfaction, anxiety, and various forms of suffering. In most human lives, active suffering predominates, whether from poverty, illness, oppression, or psychological torment. And this imbalance is not accidental or correctable. It follows directly from the nature of will. Since will is endless wanting, and since satisfaction is merely temporary absence of wanting, pain must be the positive reality, while pleasure is merely negative, merely the temporary removal of pain. Pleasure is the shadow cast by pain, not an independent positive state. Most people resist this conclusion because it is so contrary to how we want to see the world. We create elaborate stories to convince ourselves that suffering serves some higher purpose, that it builds character, that it leads to eventual happiness, that it is somehow justified by cosmic justice. But Schopenhauer argues that these are just comforting illusions we create to make existence bearable. When you look honestly at life, you see that suffering is primary, purpose is absent, and justice is a human invention with no cosmic backing. This does not mean that life contains no positive experiences. Beauty, love, achievement, understanding, all of these are real. But Schopenhauer would say that even these positive experiences are best understood as temporary relief from the fundamental condition of wanting and suffering. The beauty of art provides a brief respite from will. The satisfaction of achievement provides temporary relief from the pain of striving. Love, when it is not possessive desire, can provide momentary transcendence of individuation. But none of these permanently solve the problem of existence, because the problem is existence itself. The suffering of existence extends beyond individuals to species and to life itself. Every species is engaged in a struggle against every other species and against its own members. The whole natural world is a theatre of suffering where beings consume each other, compete desperately for resources, and experience countless forms of pain before inevitable death. And all of this is will struggling against itself, since there is ultimately only one will expressing itself through all these forms. Understanding this is not meant to induce despair, though it certainly can. Schopenhauer's point is that we must see reality clearly before we can respond to it appropriately. Most people spend their lives pursuing satisfactions that can never ultimately satisfy, seeking solutions to a problem whose nature they do not understand. This pursuit itself adds additional layers of unnecessary suffering because we expect outcomes that the nature of existence makes impossible. But here is where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes practical rather than just theoretical. If you understand that suffering is inherent in will itself, you stop blaming yourself or others or circumstances for the suffering you experience. You stop expecting that the next achievement, the next relationship, the next purchase will finally bring lasting satisfaction. You see through the illusion that happiness is just around the corner if only you can reach that next goal. This clear seeing does not eliminate suffering, but it eliminates many of the false hopes that make suffering worse. Ian. Part 3. The First Path. Aesthetic Contemplation. If life is fundamentally suffering because we are manifestations of blind will constantly striving without satisfaction, is there any escape? Schopenhauer believed there are actually 3 paths to relief from the suffering of existence. The first and most accessible is aesthetic contemplation, the experience of beauty in art and nature. What happens when you genuinely experience beauty? Time seems to stop. Your ordinary concerns fade into the background. You are no longer caught up in the pursuit of personal goals or worried about future problems. You are completely absorbed in pure perception, pure awareness of what you are experiencing. This state is fundamentally different from your ordinary consciousness, and Schopenhauer believed he understood why. In aesthetic contemplation, you temporarily cease to be a willing subject and become a pure, will-less subject of knowledge. You are no longer experiencing things in terms of what they mean for you, how they relate to your desires, whether they are useful or threatening. Instead, you are perceiving the Platonic ideas, the eternal forms that are objectified in particular things. You are seeing not this particular tree in terms of its potential utility, but the essential form of treeness itself, independent of all relations and uses. This shift from willing subject to knowing subject is the key to understanding why aesthetic experience provides relief from suffering. Remember that all suffering comes from will, from wanting, from striving. When you temporarily cease to will, when you become pure perception without desire, you also temporarily cease to suffer. The constant pressure of wanting drops away. The endless cycle of lack and temporary satisfaction pauses. You enter a state of calm contemplation that is perhaps the closest thing to peace that existence allows. Think about your own experiences of genuine aesthetic absorption, perhaps looking at a painting that completely captured your attention, perhaps listening to music that transported you beyond your ordinary concerns, perhaps standing before a natural scene, mountains, ocean, stars, that filled your awareness entirely. In these moments, you were not thinking about your problems, planning your next actions, or wishing things were different. You simply were, perceiving without wanting, aware without striving. Schopenhauer particularly emphasized music as the highest form of art because music does not represent the ideas of particular things. Instead, Music directly represents the will itself, not in its individual manifestations, but in its essential nature. When you listen to profound music, you are experiencing the rise and fall, the tension and resolution, the striving and resting that characterize will itself. But you are experiencing it aesthetically, as contemplation rather than as actual wanting. This is why music can be both deeply moving and simultaneously calming. It shows you the structure of existence itself, while allowing you to experience it from a position of will-less knowing. Each art form provides this relief through different means. Visual arts allow you to perceive the ideas of natural and human-made forms. Literature allows you to understand human character and action from a distance that removes the urgency of actual involvement. Architecture provides forms that balance opposing forces into stable harmony. All of these create temporary refuges from the demands of will. But aesthetic contemplation is not just passive reception. It requires what Schopenhauer called genius, the capacity to lose yourself in pure contemplation, to forget your individuality and your practical concerns completely. Most people rarely achieve this capacity because they remain too caught up in willing. They look at a painting and think about its monetary value or what it says about their taste. They listen to music while mentally rehearsing their to-do lists. They walk through nature while worrying about work or relationships. Their perception is colored by will at every moment. The genius, whether artistic creator or appreciative audience, has the capacity to transcend this practical orientation and enter pure contemplation. This capacity is partly innate temperament, partly cultivated skill. It requires enough basic security that survival concerns do not dominate consciousness. It requires education and exposure that develop refined perception. It requires what Schopenhauer called a certain abnormality, a departure from the normal human orientation toward willing. Creating art requires an additional element beyond aesthetic perception, the ability to communicate what you have perceived to others. The artist must first achieve will-less contemplation of the ideas, then find ways to embody those ideas in material forms that others can perceive. This is why great art has lasting value. It provides access to will-less contemplation for people who might not achieve it on their own. It opens windows into that rare state of peace where suffering pauses. But here is the limitation of aesthetic contemplation that Schopenhauer was honest about. It is temporary. You cannot live in aesthetic contemplation continuously. Eventually you must return to the world of willing, of practical concerns, of desires, and their attendant suffering. The painting does not eliminate hunger. The music does not solve your problems. The beautiful landscape does not change your difficult circumstances. Aesthetic experience provides relief, sometimes profound and transformative relief, but it does not provide a permanent solution. This is why Schopenhauer called aesthetic contemplation the first path. It is the most accessible form of relief from suffering because it requires no moral transformation, no radical life change, no exceptional circumstance. Anyone can, in principle, experience aesthetic contemplation. All it requires is the temporary ability to forget yourself and your wants, to lose yourself in pure perception. And this accessibility makes aesthetic contemplation valuable, even though it is temporary. Regular engagement with beauty, whether in art or nature, provides regular relief from the pressure of willing. It reminds you that there is a mode of consciousness beyond endless striving. It demonstrates that peace is possible, even if only in moments. It offers what Schopenhauer called the Sabbath of the penal servitude of willing, a day of rest from the endless labor of desire. For most people, aesthetic contemplation will be the primary path to whatever relief from suffering they experience. Not everyone can achieve the ethical transformation that leads to the second path. Not everyone can or should pursue the complete denial of will that constitutes the third path. But almost everyone can cultivate the capacity for aesthetic contemplation, can seek out experiences of beauty, can create spaces in their lives where will-less knowing becomes possible. This is practical wisdom, not just philosophical theory. When you feel overwhelmed by desires, problems, and suffering, deliberately seek aesthetic experiences. Visit a museum, listen to profound music, spend time in nature, read great literature, not as entertainment or distraction, but as genuine contemplation that temporarily lifts you out of willing. These moments of relief are valuable not because they solve your problems, but because they demonstrate that there is more to consciousness than endless wanting. Part 4. The second path. Ethics and compassion. The second path to relief from suffering is ethical transformation through the recognition of the underlying unity of all beings. If you truly understand that all individuals are manifestations of the same will, that the boundaries between self and other are ultimately illusory, then your entire moral orientation shifts. You can no longer pursue your own interests at the expense of others because you recognize that others are not really separate from you. Their suffering is your suffering. Their joy is your joy. Harming them is harming yourself. This is the metaphysical foundation of Schopenhauer's ethics, and it is completely different from traditional moral philosophy. Kant grounded ethics in rational duty. Utilitarians ground it in calculating consequences. Schopenhauer grounded ethics in direct perception of metaphysical truth, that we are all one. When you harm another person, you are usually able to do so because you experience them as fundamentally separate from yourself. Their pain is their problem, not yours. Their loss is your gain. But if you could fully grasp that this separateness is illusory, that you and they are manifestations of the same underlying will, you would find it as difficult to harm them as it is to harm yourself. This is not moral duty imposed from outside. This is natural compassion arising from genuine understanding. Compassion is the key virtue in Schopenhauer's ethics, and he meant something very specific by it. Compassion is the direct, immediate participation in another's suffering. Not pity from a distance, not duty-bound assistance, but actual feeling of their pain as if it were your own. This is possible because, at the deepest level, it is your own. When you experience genuine compassion, the barrier between self and other temporarily dissolves. You recognize your essential identity with the suffering being before you. This recognition leads naturally to the two fundamental principles of ethics. First, harm no one. Second, help everyone as much as you can. The first principle, injustice harm, follows immediately from recognizing that harming another is ultimately harming yourself. The second principle, active compassion, follows from recognizing that relieving another's suffering is relieving your own suffering, since there is ultimately no distinction between your suffering and theirs. But Schopenhauer was realistic about how difficult this ethical transformation is to achieve. Most people, most of the time, experience themselves as fundamentally separate individuals pursuing their own interests. This experience is reinforced by every aspect of embodied existence. Your body is here, not there. Your pain is immediate to you, while others' pain is merely observed. Your desires emerge from within, while others' desires appear as external obstacles or opportunities. The illusion of separateness is powerful and persistent. Moreover, we are all manifestations of will, and will is inherently egoistic. The drive to preserve and enhance our own existence is not a moral failing, but the basic expression of will at the individual level. Self-assertion is natural. Competition for resources is inevitable. Conflict of interests is unavoidable. Ethics requires transcending this natural egoism, but transcendence is rare and difficult. This is why Schopenhauer had no patience for moral philosophies that assume humans are naturally good or that virtue is easy. He saw clearly that humans, like all manifestations of will, are naturally egoistic and will pursue their own interests unless something intervenes to change this orientation. Morality is not natural. Morality requires seeing through the illusion of separateness that our entire embodied existence reinforces. What enables this seeing? Schopenhauer believed it comes through suffering. When you experience genuine suffering, when life breaks down the comfortable illusions that protect you from reality, you become capable of recognizing that same suffering in others. Your pain opens your eyes to the universality of pain. Your vulnerability reveals the vulnerability of all beings. The barrier between self and other weakens because you recognize that the same metaphysical predicament affects all manifestations of will. This is why Schopenhauer valued suffering, even as he acknowledged its negativity. Suffering has moral value because it can lead to compassion. The person who has never suffered remains locked in egoism. The person who has suffered deeply and honestly becomes capable of genuine ethical insight. This does not mean that suffering automatically makes people moral. Many people respond to suffering with increased egoism, bitterness, or cruelty. But suffering creates the possibility of ethical transformation in a way that comfort and success do not. The ethical life, then, consists in living with constant awareness of the metaphysical unity underlying apparent individuation. This awareness manifests as justice, refusing to harm others because you recognize your identity with them. And it manifests as love, actively working to relieve suffering because you see all suffering as your own. Not the romantic love that is possessive desire and therefore just another form of egoistic will, but the universal love that springs from recognizing yourself in every being. Schopenhauer particularly emphasized compassion for animals as a test of genuine ethics. Most moral philosophers limited ethics to relations between humans, finding various reasons why animals do not deserve moral consideration. But if the foundation of ethics is recognition of shared being, then this recognition must extend to all beings that suffer. The animal experiences pain just as you do. The animal fears death just as you do. The animal is a manifestation of will just as you are. To harm an animal unnecessarily is to fail to recognize your essential unity with all life. This ethical orientation leads to specific practical implications. It condemns all forms of exploitation and cruelty. It demands vegetarianism or at least minimizing animal suffering. It requires absolute honesty and justice in dealing with others. It calls for active help to those who suffer, human or animal. It insists on seeing through all forms of deception that justify harming some for the benefit of others. But Schopenhauer also recognized that perfect ethics is impossible while we remain embodied manifestations of will. We must eat, and eating requires ending other lives, plant or animal. We must occupy space and use resources that might benefit others. We inevitably cause some suffering simply by existing. The ethical life is not about achieving perfection, but about minimizing harm and maximizing compassion within the constraints of embodied existence. The ethical transformation provides more relief from suffering than aesthetic contemplation because it is more sustained. You cannot live in aesthetic contemplation continuously, but you can maintain an ethical orientation constantly. When you genuinely see others as yourself, you experience their joy as your joy and work to increase it. You experience their suffering as your suffering and work to relieve it. This shifts your attention away from the impossible project of satisfying your own desires and toward the meaningful project of relieving suffering generally. Moreover, ethical living provides the psychological benefits of reduced guilt, clearer conscience, and the satisfaction of living according to your understanding of truth. You are no longer constantly in conflict with reality or with your better nature. You have aligned your actions with your metaphysical insight. This alignment brings a form of peace that egoistic living, however successful, can never provide. But even the ethical life does not completely eliminate suffering. You still experience your own pain. You now also experience empathetic suffering when you witness others' pain. And you remain a manifestation of will, subject to all the limitations and frustrations inherent in that condition. The ethical transformation provides significant relief from suffering, but it is not the complete solution. For that, Schopenhauer believed we must look to the third and final path. Part 5. The third path: denial of the will to live. There is a state beyond aesthetic contemplation and beyond ethical transformation. It is rare, difficult, and radical, but Schopenhauer believed it represents the only complete liberation from suffering: the denial of the will to live. This does not mean suicide, which Schopenhauer explicitly rejected. Suicide is actually an affirmation of will, the will rejecting its current circumstances, while still asserting its fundamental desire for existence. The denial of will means something much deeper and more profound. To deny the will to live is to see through the illusion of individuation so completely that you no longer identify with your individual manifestation of will. You recognize yourself not as this particular person with these particular desires, but as the universal will temporarily appearing in this form. This recognition is so complete that the ordinary drives and desires that motivate human action lose their power over you. You no longer want in the usual sense. You exist, but you exist without that constant pressure of desire that characterizes normal consciousness. This state is what various mystical and ascetic traditions have described throughout history. The Buddhist Enlightenment, the Christian Via Negativa, the Hindu moksha, all of these point toward the same underlying reality: the possibility of liberation through complete transcendence of individual willing. Schopenhauer studied these traditions carefully and believed they were describing genuine states of consciousness that his philosophy could explain in secular, philosophical terms. What does this denial of will actually look like in practice? The person who has achieved it no longer pursues personal advantage. They have no ambition, no desire for pleasure, no fear of pain. They live simply, needing little, wanting nothing. They treat others with universal compassion because they no longer experience themselves as separate from others. They remain alive but detached from life, going through the motions of existence without investment in outcomes. They have achieved what Schopenhauer called the peace that passes all understanding. But why would anyone seek this state? Because it represents complete liberation from suffering. Remember that all suffering comes from will, from the gap between what we want and what we have. When willing ceases, suffering ceases. The person who wants nothing can lack nothing. The person who strives for nothing cannot be frustrated. The person who identifies with nothing cannot lose anything. This is not the peace of temporary satisfaction, which is just the pause before new desires emerge. This is the peace of extinguished desire itself. Schopenhauer was honest that this state is extraordinarily difficult to achieve and impossible to maintain perfectly while embodied. The body has its own demands: hunger, thirst, pain, that constitute minimal willing. Complete denial of will would mean death, and death comes when it comes, not through deliberate seeking. But degrees of will denial are possible, and even partial achievement provides proportional relief from suffering. The path to this denial involves asceticism, deliberate practices that weaken the will's hold on consciousness. Fasting reduces the body's demands. Celibacy eliminates the powerful sexual will. Poverty removes attachment to possessions. Solitude weakens social desires. Meditation quiets the constant internal chatter of wanting. These practices, found in various forms across mystical traditions, serve the same purpose: to loosen will's grip on consciousness. But Schopenhauer emphasized that true asceticism must come from genuine insight, not from imposed rules or desire for spiritual status. Forced asceticism that comes from will, the will to be holy, the will to transcend, is not genuine denial, but just another form of assertion. True denial arises spontaneously from seeing so clearly into the nature of will and suffering that continued willing becomes impossible. It is not chosen, but rather emerges naturally from complete understanding. This is why Schopenhauer did not prescribe the ascetic path for everyone. It requires a particular temperament, unusual circumstances, and genuine metaphysical insight. Most people should focus on aesthetic contemplation and ethical transformation, which provide significant relief from suffering without requiring the complete renunciation that ascetic denial demands. The ascetic path is for the rare individual who cannot rest until they have achieved complete liberation. Schopenhauer himself did not claim to have achieved this state. He lived comfortably, enjoyed good food, appreciated art and music, and cared deeply about his reputation and the reception of his work. He described the denial of will philosophically, but did not claim to embody it personally. This honesty is important. He was not a guru claiming special attainment, but a philosopher describing what he believed was possible based on his understanding of metaphysics and his study of mystical traditions. The denial of will also has implications beyond individual liberation. If some individuals achieve genuine will denial, they become living demonstrations that liberation is possible. They show that human consciousness is not inevitably trapped in willing, that the suffering inherent in will can be transcended. This demonstration provides hope and direction for others who sense that ordinary existence is fundamentally unsatisfactory, but do not know what alternative might exist. Moreover, even contemplating the possibility of will denial changes your relationship with ordinary willing. When you understand that desires are not absolute commands that must be obeyed, but rather manifestations of will that can be observed and potentially transcended, you gain a certain distance from your own wanting. You can experience desire without being completely identified with it. You can notice the structure of wanting without immediately acting on every impulse. This space between desire and action is the beginning of freedom. But Schopenhauer would be the first to acknowledge that for most people, most of the time, complete denial of will is neither possible nor appropriate. We are embodied beings with real needs. We live in social contexts that require action. We have responsibilities to others that demand engagement. The ascetic ideal may be the theoretical endpoint of his philosophy, but the practical wisdom is to work with will rather than expecting to transcend it entirely. This working with will means understanding its nature, not being deceived by its promises, finding what relief is available through aesthetic contemplation and ethical living, and maintaining awareness that lasting satisfaction through will fulfillment is impossible. It means neither mindlessly pursuing every desire nor expecting complete liberation. It means living with eyes open, accepting the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of existence while finding what moments of peace are available. The third path remains important not because everyone should or can follow it, but because it completes the philosophical system. It shows the logical endpoint of understanding will. If will is the source of suffering, then complete cessation of will is complete cessation of suffering. Whether this cessation is achievable in embodied life remains an open question, but its theoretical possibility provides a compass point that orients the entire philosophy. Part 6. Wisdom for Living, Counsels and Maxims. Schopenhauer was not just a metaphysician constructing abstract systems. He was also intensely interested in the practical question of how to live well, given the nature of reality he had discovered. His essays on wisdom for living, collected in The Wisdom of Life and the Aphorisms, contain advice that is simultaneously pessimistic in its assumptions and surprisingly practical in its recommendations. The foundation of his practical wisdom is this: since lasting happiness through will satisfaction is impossible, you must focus instead on minimizing suffering and making the best of an inherently problematic existence. This is not inspiring in the conventional sense, but it is honest. And from this honest foundation, Schopenhauer developed insights about daily life that remain remarkably valuable. First, manage your expectations ruthlessly. Most suffering comes not from actual circumstances, but from the gap between what you expected and what actually occurred. If you expect life to be fundamentally satisfactory, you will be constantly disappointed. If you expect people to be rational, just, and kind, you will be constantly betrayed. If you expect your efforts to be recognized and rewarded, you will be constantly frustrated. But if you expect life to be difficult, people to be flawed, and efforts to be unappreciated, you will rarely be disappointed and occasionally be pleasantly surprised. This does not mean becoming cynical or bitter. It means adjusting your expectations to match reality rather than wishful thinking. When you expect difficulty and encounter it, you respond calmly as to something normal. When you expect nothing from others and receive kindness, you experience genuine gratitude rather than entitled disappointment. This recalibration of expectations is one of the most practical steps toward reducing unnecessary suffering. Second, cultivate independence from external circumstances and other people's opinions. Schopenhauer observed that most people are slaves to what others think of them. They base their self-worth on external validation, which means they are perpetually anxious and vulnerable. Since you cannot control what others think, basing your peace of mind on their opinions guarantees suffering. The solution is to develop what Schopenhauer called inner resources, capabilities, knowledge, and character that provide satisfaction independent of external circumstances. The person who can think interesting thoughts needs no company to avoid boredom. The person who has internal standards of excellence needs no external validation to judge their work. The person who finds meaning in their own development needs no recognition from others to feel valuable. This independence is difficult to achieve because we are social beings with natural desires for approval and connection. But degrees of independence are possible, and each degree achieved reduces your vulnerability to circumstances beyond your control. You become more self-sufficient, more resilient, and less dependent on the volatile contingencies of external life. Third, choose your associations carefully and limit them ruthlessly. Most people drain your energy rather than enhancing it. Most social interactions are shallow performances that provide neither genuine connection nor valuable solitude. Most relationships are based on mutual use rather than genuine care. Schopenhauer's advice was to prefer solitude to bad company and to seek out the rare individuals capable of substantive connection while avoiding everyone else. This might seem misanthropic, and Schopenhauer certainly was misanthropic. But his reasoning was sound. Your time and energy are finite, and every hour spent in meaningless social interaction is an hour not spent on activities that might provide genuine satisfaction. Better to be alone with your thoughts than surrounded by people whose company provides neither pleasure nor profit. Better to have one meaningful friendship than a dozen superficial acquaintances. Fourth, understand the role of health in well-being and prioritize it accordingly. Schopenhauer observed that 9/10 of happiness depends on health. Without basic physical well-being, nothing else provides much satisfaction. With health, even modest circumstances can be tolerable. This means that maintaining health through diet, exercise, sleep, and avoiding harmful substances is more important than pursuing wealth, status, or most other conventional goals. This is practical wisdom that people often ignore in pursuit of achievements that require sacrificing health. They work excessive hours, neglect their bodies, accept chronic stress, and then wonder why success feels hollow. Schopenhauer would say they have priorities exactly backwards. Secure health first, then pursue other goals within the constraints that maintaining health requires. Fifth, live well below your means and avoid the trap of hedonic adaptation. Whatever your income level, you will quickly adapt to it and begin to feel that you need more. This adaptation is endless. There is no amount of wealth that feels like enough because the will always generates new desires once old ones are satisfied. The solution is to deliberately live more simply than you can afford, creating a buffer that protects you from financial anxiety and provides freedom from the need to continuously increase income. Schopenhauer himself lived modestly despite having sufficient means for luxury. He understood that luxury adds little to actual satisfaction while creating dependencies and anxieties. The person who has learned to be content with simple pleasures is more secure than the person who requires elaborate provisions for basic contentment. Sixth, structure your time to avoid the twin dangers of stress and boredom. When you are overwhelmed by demands, you suffer from stress and anxiety. When you have nothing meaningful to occupy you, you suffer from boredom and restlessness. The art of living well involves finding the right balance, enough challenge to prevent boredom, enough ease to prevent exhaustion. For most people, this means choosing work that is moderately challenging and meaningful but not consuming. It means having activities and interests that provide engagement without pressure. It means creating rhythms of effort and rest that prevent both burnout and stagnation. This balance is individual and requires experimentation to discover, but finding it dramatically improves quality of life. Seventh, develop your mind continuously throughout life. The intellect, unlike the body, can continue to develop and provide satisfaction even in old age. Reading, thinking, learning, and creating offer pleasures that do not depend on youth, health, or circumstance. The person who has cultivated intellectual interests is never bored and never solely dependent on external entertainment. They carry their source of satisfaction within themselves. Schopenhauer was particularly emphatic about reading quality material rather than consuming whatever is currently popular. Most contemporary writing is mediocre and will be forgotten. The classics remain valuable because they contain genuine insight that transcends their particular time and place. Better to read one great book multiple times than to skim through dozens of forgettable ones. Eighth, accept aging and mortality without denial or despair. Most people spend enormous energy trying to appear younger than they are or denying the reality of their advancing age. This is futile and adds unnecessary suffering to the inevitable process of decline. Schopenhauer advised accepting each stage of life for what it is, finding appropriate satisfactions at each stage, and preparing mentally for the end rather than pretending it will not come. This acceptance also means not clinging desperately to youth or resenting young people for having what you have lost. The old person who accepts their age with dignity experiences less suffering than the old person who desperately tries to recapture youth, and accepting mortality makes it possible to live more fully in the present rather than in constant anxiety about the future. Ninth, understand that reputation and honor are largely illusions, but manage them practically nonetheless. Schopenhauer had contempt for people who base their self-worth on others' opinions. At the same time, he recognized that reputation has practical consequences that cannot be ignored. The solution is to maintain sufficient reputation to function effectively in society while not depending on reputation for your sense of self-worth. This means being honest in your dealings, fulfilling your obligations, and avoiding behavior that would damage your practical interests. But it also means not agonizing over what others think, not seeking fame or recognition, and not allowing concern for reputation to prevent you from living according to your own standards and insights. 10th, recognize that most human behavior is driven by vanity, stupidity, and malice, and adjust your expectations accordingly. This sounds harsh, but Schopenhauer believed it was simply accurate. Most people are not thoughtful, not well-intentioned, and not capable of much beyond pursuing their immediate interests in short-sighted ways. Expecting otherwise leads to constant disappointment. When you understand human nature realistically, you stop taking personally what others do. You recognize that their behavior reflects their nature and circumstances, not your worth. You become less angry, less hurt, and less surprised by the selfishness, pettiness, and cruelty that you observe. This clear seeing is not cynicism, but realism, and it provides significant protection against unnecessary emotional suffering. These practical counsels flow naturally from Schopenhauer's Metaphysics. If the world is will and will is suffering, then wisdom consists in managing will as skillfully as possible. Reduce unnecessary desires, cultivate internal resources, protect yourself from dependency on volatile externals, maintain health, develop your mind, accept reality, and manage practical necessities without emotional investment. This is not a recipe for ecstatic happiness, but it is a reliable path to minimizing suffering and finding what satisfaction existence allows. Part 7. On Love, Sex, and the Metaphysics of Sexual Attraction. Few philosophers have written as penetratingly about love and sexuality as Schopenhauer. His essay, The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, remains one of the most psychologically insightful analyses of romantic attraction ever written, and his conclusions are characteristically unsentimental and disturbing. Schopenhauer's central claim is that romantic love is not what it appears to be. We experience it as a personal feeling directed at a unique individual whose qualities make them perfect for us. We believe we are choosing freely based on genuine affinity and shared values. But Schopenhauer argues that this is an elaborate illusion created by the will of the species, which uses individual consciousness for its own reproductive purposes. What we call falling in love is actually the species' will, recognizing a potential mate whose genetic characteristics would combine well with our own to produce healthy offspring. The intensity of attraction corresponds to the biological suitability of the match. The obsessive quality of romantic passion reflects the importance of reproduction to the species. The sense that this particular person is uniquely right reflects unconscious calculation of genetic compatibility. Think about the characteristics that trigger romantic attraction: youth, health, symmetry, secondary sexual characteristics. All of these are indicators of reproductive fitness. The qualities that make someone romantically attractive are precisely the qualities that would contribute to successful reproduction. This is not coincidence, but the fundamental purpose of romantic attraction. Schopenhauer observed that we rarely fall in love with people who are similar to us. Instead, we are attracted to people whose characteristics balance and complement our own. The tall person is attracted to short partners. The delicate person seeks someone robust. The intellectual seeks someone practical. This is the will of the species ensuring genetic diversity in offspring by creating attraction between complementary types. This analysis explains many otherwise puzzling features of romantic love. Why does it feel so compulsive and involuntary? Because it is not really your choice, but the species using your consciousness for its purposes. Why does it make people behave irrationally, sacrificing their interests and judgment? Because individual well-being is irrelevant to the species' will, which cares only about reproduction. Why does passionate love so often fade after childbirth or after the possibility of reproduction passes? Because its purpose has been fulfilled, and the illusion no longer needs to be maintained. Schopenhauer went further, arguing that the individual consciousnesses involved in romantic love are being deceived and exploited. You think you are pursuing your own happiness by uniting with your beloved. But the species' will is actually using your desire to accomplish its goal of reproduction. After you have served this purpose, the illusion fades, and you often find yourself attached to someone who is not actually compatible with your long-term happiness. This is why so many marriages that began with passionate love end in disappointment or conflict. The attraction that brought people together was based on reproductive compatibility, not on compatibility for living together peacefully over decades. The qualities that make someone an attractive mate from the species perspective may be quite different from the qualities that make someone a suitable life partner from the individual perspective. Schopenhauer's advice, characteristically dark, was to be skeptical of romantic passion and not to make major life decisions while under its influence. The intense attraction you feel is not reliable guidance about whether this person would actually make a good partner. It is the species will manipulating your consciousness for purposes that may conflict with your individual well-being. But Schopenhauer also acknowledged that romantic love, illusory though it may be, is among the most powerful experiences human consciousness can have. The intensity of passion, the sense of finding someone uniquely suited to you, the willingness to sacrifice everything for union. These experiences, however deceptive in their ultimate nature, provide some of the highest peaks of human feeling. Even if they are ultimately in service of the species rather than the individual, they still constitute profound subjective experiences. His analysis extended to different types of love and attachment. Parental love, particularly maternal love, is not illusory in the same way because it directly serves both individual and species interests in protecting offspring. Friendship based on genuine affinity and shared understanding can be real because it does not originate in reproductive impulses. Compassionate love that recognizes the shared suffering of all beings is perhaps the only form of love that transcends the will's deceptions entirely. But romantic love specifically, the passionate, obsessive, seemingly fated attraction between potential mates, this Schopenhauer saw as fundamentally deceptive. It is nature's most powerful trick for ensuring reproduction, dressed up in the costume of personal choice and individual fulfillment. The person who understands this is not necessarily immune to romantic passion, but they can at least see it for what it is, and perhaps avoid some of the worst consequences of believing its illusions. This analysis makes Schopenhauer sound deeply unromantic, and he was. He never married, had no children, and seemed to view romantic relationships primarily as sources of conflict and disappointment. But his analysis has been substantially confirmed by evolutionary psychology and remains valuable precisely because it cuts through the sentimentality that surrounds these topics. Understanding the biological and metaphysical basis of sexual attraction does not eliminate its power, but it does provide perspective that can prevent some suffering. The broader implication is that many of our most powerful feelings and motivations are not what they appear to be. They are manifestations of will pursuing its own ends through our consciousness. We experience them as our own desires, our own choices, our own feelings. But Schopenhauer would say we are instruments being played by forces whose purposes differ from our conscious goals. This is disturbing but important to understand if we want to see clearly how existence actually operates. Part 8. On Women, Family and Social Life. Schopenhauer's views on women and gender relations were deeply problematic even by the standards of his time. His essay On Women contains passages of straightforward misogyny that are impossible to defend or explain away. He viewed women as intellectually inferior, morally childlike, and suited primarily for reproduction and household management. These views reflected the prejudices of his era, but went beyond even those prejudices in their harshness and contempt. It is important to acknowledge this directly, rather than attempting to sanitize it. Schopenhauer's philosophy contains genuine insights about suffering, will, and existence. But his views about women were based on cultural prejudice and personal bitterness, rather than on philosophical rigor. His difficult relationship with his mother, his isolation from family life, and his limited interactions with women all contributed to perspectives that were narrow and unjust. That said, some of his observations about family life and social relations contain insights worth extracting from their problematic framing. He recognized that family obligations create significant constraints on individual freedom and development. The person with dependents cannot pursue risky opportunities, cannot move freely, cannot focus exclusively on their own development. This is not specifically about gender, but about the reality that caregiving responsibilities limit options. He also observed that social life generally involves elaborate performances where people pretend to be more interested in each other than they actually are. Most social interaction, he argued, is based on mutual pretense rather than genuine connection. People gather not because they actually enjoy each other's company, but because solitude is even more uncomfortable for those who lack internal resources. This observation about the superficiality of most social bonds remains valid regardless of his problematic views. About gender, Schopenhauer's preference for solitude and his skepticism about social life generally stemmed from his belief that most people are not capable of substantive thought or genuine connection. He divided humanity into two categories: the vast majority who are driven entirely by will with minimal, genuine consciousness, and the rare individuals capable of genuine reflection and aesthetic or philosophical insight. Only with this latter group, he believed, was meaningful interaction possible. This elitism is off-putting but contains a kernel of truth. Not all human connections are equally valuable, and indiscriminate socializing often provides less satisfaction than selective solitude. The person who prefers reading a great book alone to attending a superficial party is not antisocial, but simply has different priorities and capabilities. In a culture that valorizes constant social connection, Schopenhauer's defense of solitude provides a valuable counterpoint. His observations about family life also contain insights despite their problematic framing. He noted that family relationships are often sources of conflict and disappointment because people are forced together by circumstance rather than choice. The person you share a household with may not be someone you would choose as a companion if you met them independently. Yet family obligations create expectations of intimacy and loyalty that may not match actual feelings. This doesn't mean family is worthless or should be avoided. But it does mean that family relationships require different management than chosen friendships. Recognizing that family members may not actually like each other very much, despite loving each other, can reduce unrealistic expectations and associated disappointments. You can fulfill family obligations without pretending that genetic connection automatically creates genuine affinity. Schopenhauer also wrote about the illusions that young people have about marriage and family life. They imagine romantic bliss lasting forever, children bringing pure joy, domestic life providing fulfillment. Then reality intervenes. Romantic passion fades. Children are difficult and expensive. Domestic life is routine and constrained. The gap between fantasy and reality creates suffering that could be reduced by more realistic expectations from the beginning. His advice was to enter family life with open eyes if you enter it at all, understanding the costs and constraints it will create. Or better yet, avoid it entirely if you have the means to support yourself independently and the internal resources to find satisfaction in solitude. This is not advice that everyone should or can follow, but for those with certain temperaments and capabilities, it may be the path to less suffering. On social hierarchies and status, Schopenhauer was clear. Most of what people compete for is worthless. Status, reputation, social position. These matter only because people agree to care about them. They have no objective value. The person who can free themselves from caring about status gains enormous freedom because they are no longer competing in games that cannot be won and that provide no real satisfaction, even to the winners. But he also acknowledged that complete indifference to social position is difficult to achieve because we are social beings shaped by our culture to care about these things. The practical wisdom is not to pretend you are above all social concerns, but to minimize the weight you give them. Maintain sufficient reputation to function effectively, but do not base your self-worth on social standing, or spend your life pursuing status that brings no genuine satisfaction. His writing on social life reveals a man who was deeply isolated, sometimes by choice and sometimes by circumstance. His isolation gave him perspective that people embedded in conventional social life rarely achieve. But it also gave him blind spots, particularly about the genuine satisfactions that healthy relationships and family bonds can provide. His philosophy is strongest on understanding suffering and will, and weakest on understanding connection and love. Part 9. On Death and Mortality. Death was a subject Schopenhauer returned to repeatedly, and his views on mortality are among the most interesting and paradoxical aspects of his philosophy. On one hand, he saw death as a natural and inevitable part of existence that should not be feared. On the other hand, his metaphysics suggested that individual death is not actually the end of existence in any ultimate sense. The fear of death, Schopenhauer argued, is largely irrational. What exactly are we afraid of? Not the state of being dead, which is simply non-existence. A return to the state we were in before birth. No one worries about the infinite time before they were born. So why worry about the infinite time after death? Both are simply non-existence, and non-existence cannot be experienced as suffering or deprivation. We fear death, Schopenhauer suggested, because we identify completely with our individual manifestation and cannot imagine existence continuing without us. But his metaphysics suggests that this identification is itself an illusion. You are not fundamentally this individual person. You are will temporarily appearing in this individual form. When this form dissolves at death, the will continues in countless other forms. In that sense, you do not really die because what you fundamentally are, will, is indestructible. This is not the same as belief in personal immortality or reincarnation of individual consciousness. Schopenhauer was clear that the individual personality does not survive death. Your memories, your preferences, your particular characteristics, all of these dissolve with the death of the body. But the underlying will that manifested as you continues manifesting in other forms. In that sense, death is both real and unreal. The individual dies, but being itself continues. This perspective was meant to provide comfort without requiring belief in supernatural survival. You can accept the death of your individual form while recognizing that what you fundamentally are is not destroyed. The fear of complete annihilation is based on incomplete understanding. Nothing is annihilated because will cannot be destroyed. Only the particular form changes. But Schopenhauer also suggested that death might actually be preferable to continued existence for those who have truly understood the nature of will. If life is essentially suffering because it is manifestation of will, then death represents release from that suffering. Not suicide, which affirms will by rejecting particular circumstances while still wanting existence. but natural death, accepted without fear or resistance, as the end of this particular manifestation of will. He observed that the very old often lose their fear of death and even welcome it as rest from the exhaustion of existence. This is not despair but realistic assessment. When you have experienced enough of life to understand its essentially unsatisfactory nature, death no longer seems like a tragedy, but like a natural conclusion. The person who has lived fully and consciously has less reason to cling desperately to continued existence. Schopenhauer was particularly critical of the way most people approach death, either through complete denial or through panic when it becomes unavoidable. Better to contemplate mortality regularly throughout life, accepting it as the inevitable conclusion of embodied existence. This regular contemplation, far from making life more anxious, actually provides perspective that reduces trivial worries and clarifies priorities. When you genuinely accept that you will die, many of the things you currently worry about reveal themselves as unimportant. Status, reputation, petty conflicts, social anxieties, all of these shrink in significance when held against the reality of mortality. This does not mean becoming morbid or depressed, but rather gaining the clarity that comes from recognizing what actually matters, given the finite nature of your existence. He also observed that death is universal, and therefore should not be seen as a personal tragedy. Every living being that has ever existed has died or will die. You are not being singled out for some unique misfortune. You are simply experiencing what all manifestations of will eventually experience: dissolution of the particular form. This universality should provide perspective that reduces the sense of personal injustice that often accompanies fear of death. Schopenhauer's advice was to live with constant awareness of mortality, but without morbid dwelling on it. Know that you will die. Accept this fact completely, and let that acceptance inform how you live. Do not waste time on activities that will seem meaningless from the perspective of your deathbed. Do not invest emotional energy in conflicts and concerns that mortality reveals as trivial. Do not cling to life so desperately that you cannot enjoy the time you have. For Schopenhauer personally, death came in 1860 at age 72, apparently from pulmonary failure. He died alone in his apartment, as he had lived most of his life. His last years had finally brought the recognition he had sought for decades, but he remained fundamentally solitary until the end. Whether he faced death with the equanimity his philosophy recommended is not recorded, but one hopes that his decades of contemplating mortality prepared him well for its arrival. His views on death connect to the broader themes of his philosophy. If you understand that individual existence is suffering, that the self is ultimately illusory, and that what you fundamentally are cannot be destroyed, then death loses much of its terror. It becomes simply a transition from one form to another, or, if you have achieved denial of will, a release from the burden of existence. Either way, it is not the tragedy that those who identify completely with their individual form believe it to be. Part 10. The Influence and Legacy. Schopenhauer died believing his work would outlive him and eventually receive the recognition it deserved. He was correct on both counts. Though dismissed and ignored during much of his active career, his influence exploded in the decades after his death and has continued to expand ever since. His impact extends far beyond academic philosophy into psychology, literature, music, and popular culture. His influence on psychology is particularly significant. Schopenhauer anticipated many of Freud's central insights by several decades: the unconscious will that drives human behavior, the role of sexuality and motivation, the mechanisms of repression and sublimation, the therapeutic value of bringing unconscious drives into consciousness. All of these Freudian concepts have clear precedence in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Freud acknowledged this debt, though perhaps not as fully as he might have. Beyond Freud, Schopenhauer influenced the entire development of depth psychology and psychoanalysis. His recognition that consciousness is not master in its own house, that powerful forces operate beneath awareness, that reason often serves as rationalization for unconscious drives, these insights became foundational to modern psychology. The contemporary understanding of motivation, desire, and the limits of rational choice all owe debts to Schopenhauer's metaphysics of will. In literature, his influence was immense. Tolstoy read Schopenhauer intensively and incorporated his ideas about suffering and compassion into novels like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Thomas Mann was profoundly influenced by Schopenhauer's aesthetics and pessimism. Proust engaged deeply with his ideas about time and memory. Borges referenced him repeatedly. The entire existentialist movement, with its focus on the absurdity of existence and the need to create meaning in a meaningless world, grew in part from seeds Schopenhauer planted. In music, his impact may have been greatest of all. Richard Wagner read Schopenhauer in 1854 and claimed the experience transformed his understanding of his own work. Wagner's mature operas, particularly Tristan und Isolde and Parsifal, are essentially Schopenhauer's philosophy set to music. The themes of desire and suffering, the redemptive power of compassion, the possibility of transcendence through denial of will, all central to Wagner's later works, come directly from Schopenhauer. Mahler, Brahms, and Schoenberg all engaged seriously with Schopenhauer's philosophy of music. His claim that music directly represents the will itself, that it is the highest art form because it bypasses representation to express reality directly, influenced how these composers understood their own work. The emotional intensity and metaphysical ambition of late Romantic music owes much to Schopenhauer's elevation of music to supreme philosophical importance. Nietzsche's relationship with Schopenhauer was complex and foundational. Nietzsche began as an enthusiastic Schopenhauerian, then spent much of his career reacting against and attempting to overcome Schopenhauer's pessimism. But even Nietzsche's rejection of Schopenhauer shows how deeply he was influenced by him. The questions Nietzsche asked, the problems he tried to solve, the style of his philosophy, all were shaped by his engagement with Schopenhauer. In philosophy proper, Schopenhauer's influence was more diffuse, but still significant. His metaphysics of will anticipated aspects of process philosophy and vitalism. His ethics of compassion influenced animal rights movements and environmental ethics. His aesthetic theory contributed to formalism and theories of aesthetic experience. His epistemology influenced phenomenology and idealist traditions. Even philosophers who disagreed with his conclusions had to contend with the questions he raised and the arguments he constructed. Wittgenstein, one of the 20th century's most important philosophers, was deeply influenced by Schopenhauer despite rarely citing him directly. The early Wittgenstein's distinction between what can be said and what can only be shown, his understanding of the limits of language, his treatment of ethics and aesthetics as transcendental, all reflect Schopenhauerian themes. The later Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach to philosophy, dissolving problems rather than solving them, also echoes Schopenhauer's understanding of philosophy's proper role. In contemporary philosophy, interest in Schopenhauer has undergone a significant revival. His philosophy of mind, with its emphasis on embodied cognition and unconscious processing, seems remarkably current. His moral philosophy, grounded in recognition of shared suffering rather than abstract principles, speaks to contemporary concerns with empathy and compassion. His pessimism, once seen as a weakness, now appears to many as honest realism, in contrast to naive optimism. Beyond academic influence, Schopenhauer has maintained remarkable cultural presence. His aphorisms are widely quoted. His pessimism resonates with people exhausted by enforced positivity. His emphasis on suffering speaks to those dealing with mental illness, chronic pain, or life difficulties that positive thinking cannot address. His permission to acknowledge that life is hard without pretending it is ultimately good provides relief to many who find conventional optimism alienating. The contemporary interest in Buddhism and Eastern philosophy in the West owes something to Schopenhauer, who was among the first Western philosophers to engage seriously with these traditions. His interpretation may not have been entirely accurate, but he opened doors that later scholars and practitioners would walk through. The current Western interest in meditation, mindfulness, and practices for managing desire and suffering can trace a lineage back through Schopenhauer's engagement with Eastern thought. His influence on pessimism as a philosophical position has been particularly lasting. While pessimism is often dismissed as merely depressive temperament rather than serious philosophy, Schopenhauer established it as a coherent metaphysical position with genuine arguments. Contemporary philosophers like David Benatar and Thomas Ligotti work in traditions Schopenhauer established, arguing that existence is fundamentally problematic and that honest acknowledgement of this is philosophy's proper task. But perhaps Schopenhauer's most important legacy is simply his honesty. In an intellectual culture that often feels obligated to find silver linings and affirm existence's ultimate goodness, Schopenhauer remains a voice saying, "Look clearly at suffering. Acknowledge how pervasive it is. Stop pretending that easy solutions exist." This honesty, while uncomfortable, provides validation for people whose experience does not match cultural narratives of progress and fulfillment. His work demonstrates that pessimism about existence is compatible with finding life worth living, that acknowledging suffering does not require despair, and that clear-eyed realism provides its own consolations. He shows that you can face life's difficulties without flinching while still finding sources of meaning and even joy. His philosophy is not life-denying despite its pessimism. It is life-accepting in a deeper sense, accepting life as it actually is, rather than as we wish it were. Part 11. The Complete Vision, Integration and Application. Schopenhauer's philosophy forms a complete system where each element supports and illuminates the others. The metaphysics of will explains why suffering is inevitable. The analysis of suffering explains why aesthetic contemplation, ethical transformation, and ascetic denial provide relief. The ethics of compassion follows from recognizing the illusory nature of individuation. The practical wisdom emerges from understanding that lasting satisfaction through will fulfillment is impossible. Every piece fits together into a coherent whole. But how do you actually apply this philosophy to your life? Not everyone can or should become an ascetic. Not everyone has temperament for prolonged aesthetic contemplation. Not everyone can achieve the ethical transformation that leads to universal compassion. Yet the philosophy offers something valuable even to those who cannot follow its most demanding paths. The first and most important application is simply seeing clearly. Schopenhauer's greatest gift is permission to acknowledge that existence is difficult, that suffering is pervasive, that many of our hopes are illusions. In a culture that demands constant positivity and treats acknowledgement of difficulty as moral failing, this permission is liberating. You can stop pretending. Stop performing happiness you do not feel. Stop blaming yourself for not achieving impossible standards. This clear seeing immediately reduces certain kinds of suffering. When you stop expecting life to be fundamentally satisfactory, you stop being constantly disappointed. When you stop expecting people to be rational and benevolent, you stop being constantly betrayed. When you stop expecting will satisfaction to bring lasting peace, you stop pursuing an impossible goal. The suffering that comes from false expectations dissolves when the expectations themselves dissolve. The second application is managing desire more skillfully. You cannot eliminate desire while embodied, but you can reduce unnecessary desires and relate differently to necessary ones. Ask yourself, is this desire serving my genuine well-being, or just the blind striving of will? Will satisfying this desire actually improve my life, or just create new problems? Am I wanting this because I genuinely value it, or because culture tells me I should want it? This questioning does not eliminate desire, but creates space between desire and action. You can experience wanting without immediately pursuing every want. You can notice desire without identifying completely with it. You can choose which desires to act on based on wisdom rather than compulsion. This space is freedom, limited but real. The third application is cultivating sources of satisfaction that do not depend on will fulfillment. Aesthetic experience, intellectual engagement, compassionate action, simple contentment. These provide satisfaction that is not structured as achieving something you lack. They are modes of being rather than modes of getting. Deliberately creating space for these experiences changes the texture of your life, even if it does not eliminate suffering. This means regularly engaging with art, nature, music, literature, not as entertainment or status signaling, but as genuine contemplation. It means developing your mind through reading and thinking, not to achieve credentials, but for the inherent satisfaction of understanding. It means cultivating compassion through service and connection, not from duty, but from recognition of shared being. These practices provide reliable sources of meaning that will-driven pursuits cannot match. The fourth application is accepting suffering without adding additional layers of resistance and complaint. Pain is inevitable, but much suffering comes from fighting against pain rather than experiencing it directly. When something hurts, physically or emotionally, you can add resentment about the unfairness, anxiety about whether it will continue, self-blame for your weakness, anger at whoever or whatever caused it. Or you can simply experience the hurt itself without all these additions. This does not mean passive acceptance of injustice or failure to address addressable problems. It means not adding unnecessary psychological suffering to inevitable existential suffering. It means distinguishing between pain you must accept and suffering you create through resistance. It means facing difficult realities directly rather than exhausting yourself fighting against what cannot be changed. The fifth application is relating more wisely to other people. When you understand that everyone is driven by will, that most behavior reflects unconscious forces rather than malicious intention, that people are struggling with the same basic predicament you face, you become less judgmental and more compassionate. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior, but it means understanding it differently and responding more effectively. You can recognize that the person who wrongs you is acting from their own suffering and limitations rather than from pure malice. This recognition does not excuse the behavior, but it changes your emotional response to it. You become less personally wounded, less caught up in resentment, more capable of responding practically rather than emotionally. This protects your peace of mind while often leading to better outcomes. The sixth application is choosing how you spend your finite time and energy more wisely. When you understand that most pursuits lead nowhere ultimate, that achievements provide only temporary satisfaction, that status and wealth add little to genuine well-being, you can focus on what actually matters to you. What would you do if you knew that no achievement would bring lasting satisfaction? That question reveals your authentic values beneath culturally imposed goals. For many people, this means less focus on career advancement and more on relationships, learning, or creative expression. For others, it means continuing ambitious pursuits, but with different motivation. Not expecting them to bring happiness, but finding meaning in the pursuit itself. For still others, it means radical simplification, reducing needs and commitments to create space for contemplation and freedom. The specific answer differs, but the question itself is clarifying. The seventh application is developing resilience through understanding. When you know that suffering is inherent in existence rather than a personal failing, you stop adding shame and self-blame to difficulty. When you understand that satisfaction is always temporary, you stop despairing when achievements feel hollow. When you recognize that life is not supposed to be constantly fulfilling, you stop treating normal difficulties as abnormal tragedies. This understanding creates psychological resilience that makes suffering more bearable. This resilience is not the same as the toxic positivity that denies real problems. It is acceptance that allows you to face problems without being destroyed by them. You can acknowledge that something is hard without catastrophizing about it. You can experience pain without believing it means something is fundamentally wrong with you or your life. You can endure what must be endured without pretending it is not difficult. The eighth application is finding meaning in understanding rather than in achievement. Schopenhauer's philosophy suggests that the pursuit of understanding reality as it is provides more reliable satisfaction than the pursuit of changing reality to match your desires. You cannot control whether you achieve your goals, but you can control whether you develop your understanding. This shift from external achievement to internal development creates a source of meaning that is less vulnerable to circumstances. This means approaching your life with curiosity about what it reveals rather than just frustration about what it lacks. Every experience, even painful ones, provides information about the nature of existence. Every difficulty reveals something about will and suffering. Every interaction teaches something about human nature. When you approach experience as data to be understood, rather than just obstacles to be overcome, everything becomes potentially meaningful. The ninth application is practicing deliberate gratitude for the moments when suffering pauses. Schopenhauer's philosophy does not promise happiness, but it suggests that the absence of acute suffering is itself a form of good fortune. When you are healthy, when your basic needs are met, when you are not currently experiencing intense pain, these states should be recognized as positive, even though they feel neutral. Most of life is not suffering intensely, and this itself is worth appreciating. This is not the forced gratitude that denies real problems, but realistic appreciation of what you have when measured against what you lack. You do not have to be grateful for existence itself if you find it fundamentally problematic. But you can appreciate specific conditions when they are better than they might be. This selective gratitude provides psychological benefit without requiring the dishonest claim that everything is for the best. The 10th application is accepting that complete answers and final solutions are impossible. Schopenhauer's philosophy does not solve the problem of existence because the problem is existence itself. There is no technique that eliminates suffering permanently, no achievement that brings lasting satisfaction, no understanding that makes everything okay. But this recognition itself provides a kind of peace. You can stop searching for the solution that will fix everything and instead work with what is actually available. This means accepting that life will always involve difficulty, that you will always have to manage suffering, that peace will always be temporary and partial. But temporary and partial peace is real peace. Moments of aesthetic contemplation are valuable, even though they end. Ethical living provides satisfaction, even though it does not eliminate all suffering. Understanding brings relief, even though it does not solve everything. Working with these limited but real sources of meaning is wiser than demanding complete solutions that do not exist. Part 12. The Dark Wisdom. Why pessimism matters. In an age of enforced optimism, motivational speakers, and positive psychology, Schopenhauer's pessimism might seem outdated or even harmful. Why dwell on suffering? Why emphasize life's difficulties rather than its possibilities? Why adopt a philosophical stance that seems designed to make people miserable? These are fair questions, and they deserve serious answers. The first reason pessimism matters is that it provides validation for people whose experience does not match cultural narratives. If you are struggling, suffering, or finding life disappointing, contemporary culture often treats this as individual failing. You are not being positive enough, not practicing gratitude sufficiently, not using the right techniques for happiness. The message is that if you are not happy, it is your fault. This creates secondary suffering about your suffering. Schopenhauer's pessimism offers a radically different message. Your suffering is not a personal failing, but a response to reality. Life is difficult, and finding it difficult is accurate perception, rather than distorted thinking. You are not broken for struggling with existence. You are honest. This validation can be profoundly relieving for people who have blamed themselves for not achieving the happiness that culture promises. The second reason is that pessimism creates realistic expectations that prevent unnecessary disappointment. When you expect life to be wonderful, and it is not, you experience the gap as tragedy. When you expect life to be difficult, and it is, you experience this as normal. And when something good happens despite your expectations, you experience genuine gratitude rather than entitled disappointment that it is not better. Pessimism creates a psychological baseline that makes actual experience more tolerable. This is not just cynicism or defensive lowering of expectations. It is calibrating expectations to match reality. The person who expects relationships to be effortlessly fulfilling will be constantly disappointed by the work relationships require. The person who expects moderate difficulty and occasional deep connection will be more satisfied with the same objective reality. The difference is entirely in expectations, and pessimism provides expectations that match existence better than optimism does. The third reason is that pessimism encourages serious engagement with suffering rather than superficial denial. When you believe life should be happy, you treat suffering as an aberration to be quickly eliminated through positive thinking or distraction. When you understand that suffering is fundamental, you engage with it more deeply, asking what it reveals and how to work with it skillfully. This deeper engagement often leads to more effective responses than optimistic denial. Think about how our culture treats depression, anxiety, and other forms of psychological suffering. The standard approach is to eliminate symptoms as quickly as possible through medication or therapy techniques designed to change thinking patterns. This can be helpful, but it also misses what suffering might be revealing about your life, your values, or your circumstances. Schopenhauer's approach suggests that suffering deserves serious attention rather than just symptom management. The fourth reason is that pessimism provides better preparation for inevitable difficulties. If you believe life should be easy and then encounter serious obstacles, you may fall apart because you are not prepared for significant challenge. If you understand that life is inherently difficult, you develop resilience before you need it. You build psychological resources for handling suffering, rather than being shocked when it arrives. This preparation makes actual hardship more manageable. Every life contains loss, illness, disappointment, and death. These are not aberrations, but standard features of human existence. The person who has contemplated suffering philosophically before experiencing it directly is better prepared than the person who has maintained optimistic denial until reality forces confrontation. Pessimism is realistic preparation rather than morbid dwelling. The fifth reason is that pessimism can paradoxically make life more enjoyable. When you expect nothing, small pleasures become gifts rather than entitlements. When you are not constantly measuring your experience against impossible standards of fulfillment, you can appreciate what is actually available. When you are not pursuing happiness as a goal, you can experience satisfaction in moments without needing them to be more than they are. This is the great paradox of Schopenhauer's philosophy. By giving up the pursuit of happiness, you become more capable of appreciating whatever happiness occurs. By accepting that life is difficult, you become less disturbed by difficulties. By acknowledging that suffering is normal, you suffer less from your suffering. The pessimistic stance creates conditions for more peace than optimistic striving ever can. The sixth reason is that pessimism is simply more intellectually honest than optimism. When you look at existence without wishful thinking, what do you see? Vast amounts of suffering in nature and human life, temporary satisfactions that solve nothing fundamental, the inevitability of decline and death, the absence of cosmic justice or ultimate purpose. You can create meaning and find beauty, but you cannot honestly claim that existence itself is organized for our benefit, or that suffering serves some higher good. Philosophical pessimism insists on facing these realities directly, rather than constructing comforting illusions. This honesty has its own value, regardless of whether it makes people happier. Understanding reality as it is, even when that reality is difficult, is a worthy goal. And this honesty provides a foundation for wisdom that optimistic illusions cannot match. The seventh reason is that pessimism creates better ethics. When you understand that everyone suffers, that this suffering is not deserved or meaningful but simply inherent in existence, you naturally become more compassionate. When you recognize that you and others are all caught in the same predicament, competition gives way to solidarity. When you see suffering as fundamental rather than as individual failing, you stop blaming victims for their circumstances. Contemporary culture often treats suffering as individual responsibility. If you are poor, sick, or struggling, you must have made bad choices. Schopenhauer's pessimism rejects this entirely. Suffering is not distributed according to desert. Bad things happen to good people constantly because existence itself is problematic. This recognition creates natural compassion rather than the judgmental stance that optimistic individualism encourages. The eighth reason is that pessimism provides permission to opt out of competitions you cannot win. If lasting satisfaction is impossible, then the rat race to achieve it is pointless. You can stop trying to keep up with others' apparent success. Stop pursuing goals that will not ultimately satisfy. Stop performing happiness you do not feel. This opting out creates space for living according to your actual values, rather than cultural scripts. Many people spend their lives pursuing socially validated goals, career success, wealth accumulation, status achievement, without stopping to ask whether these goals serve their genuine well-being. Schopenhauer's pessimism suggests that since none of these achievements will bring lasting satisfaction, you might as well focus on what actually matters to you. This permission to step outside conventional ambition is liberating for those who never fit standard templates anyway. The ninth reason pessimism matters is that it takes suffering seriously as a philosophical problem rather than treating it as mere emotional dysfunction. Most contemporary philosophy and psychology treat suffering as a practical problem to be managed rather than a metaphysical reality to be understood. Schopenhauer insists that suffering reveals something fundamental about existence and deserves philosophical attention at the highest level. This elevation of suffering from practical problem to philosophical subject gives dignity to the question of how to live with difficulty. It suggests that struggling with existence is not weakness, but engagement with deep reality. It positions philosophy as something relevant to actual human experience, rather than just abstract intellectual games. For people dealing with real suffering, this philosophical seriousness can be more helpful than therapeutic techniques that treat suffering as mere malfunction. The 10th reason is that pessimism provides a foundation for genuine joy in the rare moments when it occurs. When you expect nothing and experience beauty, understanding, or connection, the experience is pure gift. You did not demand it or feel entitled to it. You are not measuring it against impossible standards. You are not anxious about it ending. You can simply experience it fully, knowing it is temporary but precious, precisely because it is temporary. Schopenhauer himself, despite his pessimism, enjoyed music deeply, appreciated art profoundly, valued understanding tremendously, and even experienced satisfaction from his eventual recognition. His pessimism did not prevent joy, but provided a framework where joy could be experienced without the anxiety and disappointment that expecting constant happiness creates. This is wisdom, not pretending life is wonderful, but appreciating the moments when suffering pauses. Part 13. The final teaching. Living without illusion. We return now to where we began, an old man in Frankfurt, dying alone, having spent his life thinking deeply about suffering, will, and the possibility of peace. What had Arthur Schopenhauer actually discovered? What can we take from his philosophy that remains valuable nearly 2 centuries after his death? The core teaching is this: see clearly. Do not deceive yourself about the nature of existence. Do not pretend that life is fundamentally satisfactory when your actual experience reveals otherwise. Do not expect achievements to bring lasting fulfillment when every past achievement has left you wanting more. Do not pursue happiness as a goal when happiness by its nature is fleeting and cannot be captured through pursuit. See what is actually there, rather than what you wish were there. This clear seeing is not pessimism in the sense of being deliberately negative. It is simply honest observation. When you look at your experience without distortion, what do you notice? That satisfaction is temporary, that new desires immediately replace satisfied ones, that much of life involves managing various forms of discomfort, that the moments of genuine peace and joy are rare and precious precisely because they are rare, that no achievement solves the fundamental problem of existence, which is existence itself. But this clear seeing also reveals possibilities that illusion obscures. When you stop expecting lasting satisfaction from will fulfillment, you can appreciate temporary satisfaction more fully. When you understand that desire itself is the problem, you can work with desire more skillfully rather than just pursuing every want. When you recognize that peace comes from transcending will rather than satisfying it, you can cultivate practices that provide that transcendence: aesthetic contemplation, ethical living, perhaps even ascetic denial. Schopenhauer's philosophy teaches that you must build on reality as it is, rather than reality as you wish it were. This is the wisdom he shares with every practical philosophy. Accept your starting point completely before attempting to move forward. You cannot solve a problem you misunderstand. You cannot respond effectively to a situation you misperceive. You cannot live well based on false premises about what life actually is. For some people, this teaching is devastating. They need to believe that existence is fundamentally good, that suffering serves a purpose, that happiness is achievable through proper effort. Schopenhauer's philosophy offers no such comfort. It says that existence is will is suffering, and while relief is possible, final satisfaction is not. For people whose psychological stability depends on believing otherwise, this may be wisdom they cannot afford to accept. But for others, perhaps for you, this teaching is liberating. It explains why nothing you achieve feels like enough, It validates your sense that something is fundamentally problematic about existence. It gives you permission to stop pretending that everything is fine or will be fine if you just work harder, think more positively, or achieve the next goal. It allows you to acknowledge that life is difficult without feeling that this acknowledgement is personal failing. And from this honest foundation, you can build something real. Not happiness in the conventional sense, but understanding. Not constant joy, but moments of peace. Not final solutions, but working approaches to managing an inherently problematic existence. Not cosmic meaning, but personal meaning created through how you choose to respond to reality as it actually is. The practical wisdom that emerges from Schopenhauer's philosophy is surprisingly simple. Reduce unnecessary desires, cultivate sources of satisfaction that do not depend on will fulfillment, treat others with compassion based on recognizing shared suffering. Accept what cannot be changed. Work skillfully with what can be changed. Find meaning in understanding rather than achievement, and appreciate temporary relief from suffering without demanding permanent solutions. This is not inspiring in the way that motivational philosophy is inspiring. It does not promise that you can achieve anything you want, or that the universe is conspiring to help you. It offers something more modest and more reliable, a clear-eyed approach to existence that provides what peace is actually available rather than promising peace that does not exist. Schopenhauer would say that most people will reject this philosophy because it requires giving up comforting illusions. They will continue pursuing satisfaction through will fulfillment, continue expecting achievements to bring lasting peace, continue believing that happiness is just around the corner, and they will continue suffering unnecessarily from disappointed expectations, from the gap between what they hoped for and what they experience, from blaming themselves for not achieving what is actually impossible. But some people, those who are ready for it, those whose suffering has prepared them for honesty, those who value truth over comfort, will find in Schopenhauer's philosophy a path forward. Not a path to traditional happiness, but a path to something more valuable. Clear understanding of reality and peace, based on accepting reality rather than fighting it. This is the complete philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. It begins with the recognition that the world is will and will is suffering. It develops through analysis of why suffering is inevitable and what forms of relief are possible. It culminates in practices that provide temporary but real peace, aesthetic contemplation, ethical compassion, and potentially ascetic denial. And it offers practical wisdom for living without illusion in a world that is not organized for our benefit. Whether you accept his metaphysics completely is less important than whether you can use his insights to live more wisely. You do not need to believe that the world is fundamentally will to recognize that desire often leads to suffering. You do not need to accept his entire system to appreciate that clear seeing reduces unnecessary pain. You do not need to become an ascetic to benefit from reducing attachments and managing desires more skillfully. Take what serves you from this philosophy. Leave what does not fit your experience or temperament. But consider seriously the core teaching. That much suffering comes from false expectations, that lasting satisfaction through will fulfillment is impossible, that peace comes from transcending will rather than satisfying it, and that honest acknowledgement of life's difficulty is the foundation for whatever wisdom is possible. This is not the last word on how to live, but it is an important word. In an age of toxic positivity and enforced optimism, Schopenhauer's voice remains valuable. In a culture that treats suffering as individual failing, his insistence that suffering is metaphysically fundamental provides needed perspective. In a time when people are exhausted from pursuing happiness that always recedes, his suggestion that happiness is the wrong goal entirely deserves consideration. The old man in Frankfurt died believing his ideas would matter. He was right. Not because his philosophy makes people happy. It does not promise that, and often does the opposite. But because his philosophy tells a truth that many people recognize in their own experience, even if they lack words for it. That existence is difficult, that suffering is pervasive, that the pursuit of satisfaction leads nowhere ultimately, and that peace comes only through seeing clearly and transcending the will that drives endless wanting. This is dark wisdom, certainly, but it is wisdom nonetheless. And for those ready to receive it, it provides something more valuable than false comfort. Honest understanding of reality and guidance for living without illusion in a world that offers no final solutions, but does offer moments of genuine peace for those who know how to find them. Arthur Schopenhauer's complete philosophy is his gift to anyone willing to face existence without flinching, to look directly at suffering, will, and the essential unsatisfactoriness of embodied life, and having looked clearly, to find what relief is actually available, rather than demanding relief that does not exist. This is not easy wisdom, but it is true wisdom. And truth, even difficult truth, has its own consolations for those brave enough to face it. Conclusion: the courage to see clearly. We began in a modest apartment in Frankfurt, with an old man and his poodle, facing death after a lifetime of solitary contemplation. We end with a question. What do you do with this philosophy? How do you take Schopenhauer's dark insights and use them to live better? The answer is not simple, because the philosophy itself is not simple. Schopenhauer does not offer easy techniques or quick fixes. He offers something more demanding and more valuable. A complete reorientation of how you understand existence and your place within it. If you take nothing else from this philosophy, take this. Your suffering is not aberration. It is not punishment. It is not even primarily the result of your circumstances, though circumstances certainly matter. Your suffering is the natural consequence of being a manifestation of will in a world that is will. You are desire itself, temporarily appearing in this form, and desire by its nature can never be finally satisfied. Understanding this does not eliminate suffering, but it eliminates the secondary suffering that comes from believing something is uniquely wrong with you or your situation. When you feel that persistent sense of dissatisfaction, even when circumstances are objectively good, you are not being ungrateful or broken. You are experiencing the fundamental nature of will. When you achieve something you wanted intensely and find the satisfaction hollow and brief, you are not doing something wrong. You are discovering what Schopenhauer spent his life teaching. That satisfaction is always temporary because will immediately generates new wanting. When you look at the world and sense that something is fundamentally problematic about existence itself, you are not being morbid or depressed. You are seeing clearly. This clear seeing is the foundation for everything else. Without it, you remain trapped in cycles of pursuit and disappointment, always believing that the next achievement, the next relationship, the next experience will finally bring the lasting peace you seek. With it, you can stop chasing what does not exist and start working with what is actually available. What is actually available? Temporary relief from suffering through aesthetic contemplation. Moments of peace when you lose yourself in beauty, art, music, or nature, and will temporarily quiets. These moments are precious, not despite being temporary, but because they are real. They demonstrate that consciousness can exist in modes other than endless wanting. Seek these moments deliberately, create space for them in your life, and appreciate them fully when they occur. What else is available? Ethical transformation through recognizing your essential unity with all suffering beings. When you truly understand that others are not separate from you, that their pain is your pain, because ultimately there is only one will expressing itself through all these apparently distinct forms, you naturally become more compassionate. This compassion is not duty imposed from outside, but natural response to seeing truly. And this ethical living provides its own satisfaction, the peace that comes from aligning your actions with your understanding of reality. What else? Practical wisdom about managing existence skillfully, reduce unnecessary desires, cultivate independence from external circumstances and others' opinions, choose relationships carefully and limit social obligations ruthlessly. Prioritize health above status and wealth. Live below your means. Structure time to balance challenge and ease. Develop your mind continuously. Accept aging and death without denial. Maintain realistic expectations about human nature. These are not glamorous teachings, but they are reliable ones. They work because they are based on clear understanding of how existence actually operates, rather than on wishful thinking about how it should operate. And for the rare few who are suited for it, what else is available? The possibility of transcending will itself through ascetic practices that loosen desire's grip on consciousness. Most people will not and should not pursue this path, but knowing it exists provides direction. Even partial movement toward will denial provides proportional relief. You do not need to become a monk to benefit from reducing attachments, managing desires more consciously, and cultivating the capacity for will-less awareness. But here is what you must understand. Schopenhauer's philosophy is not for everyone. Some people genuinely need to believe that existence is fundamentally good, that suffering serves a purpose, that happiness is achievable through proper effort. For these people, Schopenhauer's pessimism may be psychologically harmful rather than helpful. There is no shame in this. Different temperaments require different philosophies. Different circumstances call for different approaches. This philosophy is for people who have already sensed that something is fundamentally problematic about existence. For people whose suffering has broken through comfortable illusions. For people who value truth over comfort and clear seeing over false consolation. For people exhausted from pursuing happiness that always recedes and ready to try a different approach entirely. If this is you, then Schopenhauer offers a path forward. It is not an easy path. It requires giving up hopes that may have sustained you for years. It requires facing truths that are genuinely difficult to accept. It requires living without the comforting belief that everything happens for a reason, or that cosmic justice exists, or that your suffering will ultimately be redeemed. It requires accepting that you will die, that everyone you love will die, that everything you build will eventually crumble, and that none of this has ultimate meaning beyond what meaning you create through how you respond to it. But this difficult path also offers something that easier paths cannot provide: genuine peace based on accepting reality rather than demanding that reality be different than it is. When you stop expecting existence to be satisfactory, you stop being disappointed by its essential unsatisfactoriness. When you stop believing that will satisfaction can bring lasting peace, you stop exhausting yourself in futile pursuit. When you accept that suffering is inherent in will itself, you stop adding the secondary suffering of believing something is wrong that needs to be fixed. This acceptance is not resignation or despair. It is clear-eyed realism that creates a stable foundation for whatever can actually be built. You can still pursue goals, but you pursue them with different understanding and different expectations. You can still seek satisfaction, but you seek it in sources less dependent on will fulfillment. You can still engage with life fully, but you engage without the desperate, attachment that creates so much unnecessary pain. Schopenhauer's life demonstrated both the power and the limitations of his philosophy. He achieved intellectual clarity that few humans ever reach. He developed insights that have influenced countless thinkers, artists, and ordinary people seeking to understand their experience. He created a philosophical system that remains relevant and valuable nearly 2 centuries after his death. But he was also profoundly isolated, never married, had no children, and spent most of his life in lonely obscurity before late recognition arrived. Was his life well lived? By conventional standards, perhaps not. By his own standards, almost certainly yes. He valued understanding above achievement, truth above comfort, clear seeing above pleasant illusion. He found satisfaction in intellectual work, aesthetic contemplation, and eventually in knowing that his ideas would outlive him. He faced death after having said what he needed to say and having lived, according to his own understanding of reality. You do not need to replicate Schopenhauer's life to benefit from his philosophy. You can be less solitary, more socially engaged, more conventionally successful, and still apply his core insights. The question is not whether to become exactly like Schopenhauer, but whether his way of seeing reality helps you live more wisely. For many people reading or hearing these words, the answer will be yes. You have already sensed much of what Schopenhauer teaches. You have already noticed that satisfaction is temporary, that desire generates suffering, that existence is fundamentally problematic. What you may have lacked is a philosophical framework that validates these observations and provides guidance for responding to them. Schopenhauer offers that framework. Take it, use it, test it against your own experience. Keep what proves valuable and discard what does not serve you. But most importantly, practice the clear seeing that is the foundation of all wisdom in this system. Look directly at your suffering without flinching. Notice the structure of desire and dissatisfaction in your own experience. Observe how will operates through you and through everyone around you. See the world as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. This clear seeing will not make you happy in the conventional sense, but it will make you wiser. It will reduce unnecessary suffering. It will provide perspective that makes inevitable suffering more bearable. It will point you towards sources of relief that actually work, rather than toward false promises that lead nowhere. It will give you permission to stop pretending and start living honestly in relationship to reality as it is. And perhaps most importantly, it will connect you to everyone else who has faced existence honestly and refused to look away. You join a lineage of thinkers, artists, and ordinary people who chose truth over comfort, who acknowledge suffering rather than denying it, who found meaning not in cosmic purpose, but in clear understanding and compassionate response to the shared predicament of existence. This is not a large or popular group, but it is a profound one. The old man in Frankfurt died alone, but he was not truly alone. He was connected through his work to every honest mind that would encounter his ideas. He spoke to you across nearly 2 centuries, offering not comfort, but something more valuable. Permission to see clearly and guidance for living without illusion. His philosophy is waiting for those ready to receive it. The question now is, are you ready? Are you ready to give up comforting illusions for uncomfortable truths? Are you ready to accept that lasting satisfaction is impossible while finding what temporary peace is actually available? Are you ready to see will operating through you and learn to work with it more skillfully? Are you ready to face suffering without adding the secondary suffering of false expectations? If the answer is yes, then Schopenhauer's complete philosophy is yours. Use it well, use it wisely, use it to reduce suffering, your own and others. Use it to find moments of genuine peace in a world that offers no permanent solutions. Use it to live with eyes open, accepting the fundamental difficulty of existence while appreciating the temporary relief and meaning that are actually available. This is not the end of philosophy or the final word on how to live, but it is a beginning of living without illusion, of clear seeing, of working with reality rather than against it. And that beginning, difficult though it may be, is worth more than all the comforting lies that keep most people trapped in cycles of pursuit and disappointment. Arthur Schopenhauer saw clearly and invited you to see clearly too. The invitation remains open. The path remains available. The wisdom remains true. What you do with it now is up to you.